the poem becomes very popular. People use it in their rituals, in salawat, and this poem traveled. So when you trace this poem traveling from Egypt to Sudan to East Africa to Ethiopia up to India, even West Africa. So people in this circulation, people either they use it as it is, even if they don't know Arabic, but they do the rhythm, or they produce a new knowledge, a new poem that imitate the Burda because the story is so popular.
Monsoon winds propelled dhows from Arabia across the Indian Ocean, facilitating trade, conquests, and the expansion of Islam. Dr. Walid Ghali, a specialist in Arabic manuscript studies at the Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilisations, Farouk Topan, the director of the Swahili Center at the Aga Khan University, and Dr. Daren Ray, who teaches African and Islamic history at Brigham Young University, tell us how Indian Ocean cultures interpreted Islam for their own settings and contexts, and left their mark on it.
This traveler, Nejapuri, Al-Nejapuri, he went right to the Far East, to Indonesia, and he was talking about the traders who were Shia and non-Shia, looked upon themselves as people who are transmitting knowledge to those who do not have knowledge. What was the world like at that time in those places?
Who is going underwater and mining coral? And later I've learned that this particular kind of carving technique with this underwater coral is the ones that are for the most important parts of the mosques. And so that kind of drew me into the rest of the Swahili world, and I was fascinated by the interplay of many Muslim groups, of Christians, of traditional African cultures, and how it just turned into this melting pot. It seemed like a real melting pot, where there's so many people bringing their influences together.
Welcome to Muslim Footprints, a deep dive into Muslim civilizations through the ages, accompanied by some of the best experts in their field. This episode is called Islam and the Indian Ocean.
Over the past couple of decades, significant new research has been undertaken across East Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and the Indian subcontinent, leading to fresh insights into Indian Ocean cultures. Can you give us some background about the history of Islam in Indian Ocean cultures?
Well, let's begin with the birth of Islam itself, the region, and that is the Arabian Peninsula, the Hijaz, and that was in the 7th century. Okay. Then Islam started spreading to Iran and to other areas within that region. Now, because it started from Arabia, a region which isn't usually thought of as a desert region, scholars in the past used to think of Islam as Islam is the desert. In other words, talking about how it spread within that region on land. But then slowly, scholars began to realize that actually the Indian Ocean has also played a significant role in the spread of Islam. And there were three major things that have arisen out of this whole region. One is that trade has taken place between various countries which border the Indian Ocean. And there are around, I think, 40 countries which border the Indian Ocean, where there are either Muslim majority or Muslim minorities. Okay. Traders come, let's say, to East Africa. Because of the monsoon winds, they come in a particular period and they have to stay there till the monsoon winds change, and then they go back. And usually these are men who trade. So when they are there for 3 months, of course, men, have different activities. And perhaps one of them, of course, it was to be in a relationship with women, and you have children, and some settled in East Africa. And this is how, in a sense, if I may take the example of East Africa, the Swahili began, the Swahili ethnicity, the Swahili culture, the Swahili music, if you like. All these things sort of started from there, if you like. And if I take again the East African example, which is replicated in other areas, you had our very first records of traders coming to East Africa was from the 2nd century of the Christian era.
This is before Islam.
Before Islam, indeed. So that's the, and then what does this imply? That implications then scholars began to study, relating it and connecting it to the Indian Ocean. So it's not just trade, but then you have social mobility, you have cultural, what we've called cultural continuum, which runs across the Indian Ocean, based on Islam, based on Muslimness, if you like. This was all, of course, before the steamships of the 19th century. So the monsoons have a very central area or central role in the Indian Ocean. If earlier we said Islam is the desert, well, Islam is the ocean, and Islam is the ocean mainly because of the monsoons, because the way it sort of, and of course the dhows, which then took people from region to region to region, as it were.
So under the various empires, you have continuous trade, intermingling, people start settling. Do they settle on both sides?
Yes.
Yes, indeed, yeah. But also it happened before Islam. It is a continuous process. Arabia is a desert, and it's facing the Indian Ocean, where they used to do trades. And the point here is that they didn't go because of Islam. They went and they used to go, and they continued to be there for trades and a cultural exchange. But when Islam came, they started to take another mission with the trade. Trade never stopped between both sides. But Islam was another layer that been added later on with the establishment of the religion itself.
And if I may add to that, you find that it's not just Islam, but then you have other peoples of other religions, going back to your earlier question of the monsoon, who also came to East Africa. Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, yes.
Between the 13th and 15th centuries, most of the city-states around the Indian Ocean reached their apogee. And then in the 1500s, something else happens. We have the discovery by Vasco da Gama in 1498 of a maritime route to Asia via Africa's Cape of Good Hope. And this completely changes the relationship between the different regions of the Indian Ocean world. You have the arrival of the Portuguese. What happens here?
I think that's a very significant date, because what you have now is the European influence coming into the Indian Ocean. And it comes via Cape of Good Hope, East Africa, to Goa, and then, of course, the process starts where you have the whole region then being influenced by Europe very slowly. And then, of course, you know the history of India, how then all the powers then began going to India and occupying or ruling India. as it were, and so forth and so on. I think
Yes, following the Portuguese, you have the Dutch, the English,
and the French.
French. Yeah.
Yeah.
So they expand into the Indian Ocean and they colonize territories and islands for commercial profit. Okay, let's now talk about Muslim identities, literature, and diasporas. So we start in Ethiopia. And we're talking about a manuscript tradition spanning the 17th and 19th centuries that's not very well known to historians. And this is from the city of Harar. So first of all, can you tell us what a manuscript tradition is, and then tell us about this particular one in Ethiopia?
Sure, yeah. Manuscript or manuscriptology or manuscript tradition is known for all cultures and religion, where they start writing their ideas on a particular way. And it's all manuscripts because it's all handwritten. There was no printing. There was no. That was the technology at that time. The technology was around creating papers, pens, and inks, and the ideas were there. And they started to develop manuscripts. So the history of Quranic manuscripts in particular is still a pure virgin area of studies up until today, for a very simple reason that we don't know how many manuscript or Quranic manuscript is available in the world, either in private collections or libraries or archives, or even in colonial archives as well. They kept fragments. And the example of Harar in this book really demonstrate the way that the Quranic manuscript studies still undervalued or understudied. The story is very simple, that in 18th century, between 17th and 19th century, specifically in 18th century, there were a couple of fragments and manuscripts that were found in private collections, either in East Africa or in Ethiopia, and both cases demonstrates lots of connection between Arabia and Indian Oceans. So in terms of the handwriting, the way that these manuscripts were outlined, the colors that been used, which is again, when you compare the colors with the Persian culture, with the Indian Ocean, it's really different. You can tell straight away from the first look, knowing that Arabia didn't know the decoration itself. So when you find the manuscript written in Arabic and with the decoration, then the first question you will ask yourself, who is the patron for this manuscript? Why it has these all colors? Why it is designed like this? And in the first chapter, the case really demonstrate or explain why we believe that the artisan either got the learning from the Indian Ocean side, or they were originally from the Indian Ocean, because the way that the manuscript is colored and outlined. Similarly, in the second chapter, demonstrate another significant manuscript, Quran manuscript, that comes from East Africa, and with its very primitive design as a manuscript. It's not sophisticated at all, but every detail in this manuscript, in every page, would tell you a story. And this is how the manuscript studies work. You do a detective work with the dead people. I mean, you interrogate a paper and the pen and the color of the pen. You interrogate the handwriting. You interrogate the cursive handwriting. Maybe he was slanted because the writer was doing something else or was busy with something else. We have many stories to tell when we look at manuscripts. So the second example comes from East Africa, showing lots of evidence that this was a living culture. It was not just someone writing. Yes, someone decided to write the Quran because it's a significant book, but why? That's the biggest question, and why he illuminated it in a particular sense. Why these colors in these pages in particular, and where he gets these color from. We know that if he wrote it in Yemen, they didn't have these type of colors. But if he wrote it in Mombasa, for example, we know that there was an Indian culture connection. So he might relied on an artisan comes from this background. Maybe he himself comes from this background. So lots of stories that you can tell around every single manuscript. And working on one of these manuscripts, or these two manuscripts, would teach us lots of stories as well. Why I believe, especially for this manuscript, that this manuscript, giving this its size, the way it's laid out, it was meant to be used every day. It's not a masterpiece. It's not a designed manuscript that the patron will put in his shelf or house to get blessing. No, it was meant to be used every day. And this would lead us to another story of creating Quranic school in East Africa, which was established in everywhere around the coast, because this was a channel or vehicle to educate people, not only on Quran, but in other social activities. So this piece, specifically Quran from East Africa, in chapter 2, speaks about these things, that this Quran was meant to be used, this Quran was deposited in a school or madrasa or a Quranic school, and it's evidence from the fingerprints on the pages. To this extent, when you take an X-ray of the pages, you can see the fingerprints. And it's not easy to keep the fingerprints that much unless you used it every day. So manuscript studies is important, but looking at Quranic manuscripts is really of significant importance as well.
You've done a particular, or you focused particularly on the place of women in these coastal societies, and you look at two Zanzibari women in your paper. Can you tell us the story of these two women?
Fascinating story, if I may say so. It's simply because these two women, one was born in 1824, or I think the
1844.
1844.
Emily Said.
Well, she was the daughter of the first Sultan of Zanzibar, and her name was Salme, or Salma, but then the German pronunciation is Salme. Okay. And she was a very independent girl, and the rule was in those days that girls did not ride horses, they rode ponies. Well, she wouldn't have none of that. She rode horses. The girls would not be taught how to write. They will not be taught how to read. Again, she taught herself. From the Quran, she copied the letters, and she taught herself how to read, how to write. And she was a very, very independent lady. Okay. Anyway, she had a home in Zanzibar town. Next door was the home of a German businessman. They fell in love. And this then became an open secret. And she knew that the time then had come to flee, because I think she was also pregnant. And so in 1866, in a very, very sort of secret way, she left for Aden. And in Aden, then she converted to Christianity, and she took the name Emily. And who was Emily? Emily was the lady who had helped her to move from Zanzibar to Aden. So that's her story up to that point. But perhaps we can continue later on, because it's a tragic story. The other lady was a villager, born 14 miles from Zanzibar town. ancestors might have been slaves, okay? But she was given the name of Mtumwa. Mtumwa means slave. She was taught the Quran. She was taught how to recite the Quran. Her work was to go in from Fumba, which was this village, into Zanzibar town to sell these pots and pans, these wares. And of course, she did that in a very beautiful way in her melodious voice. So there was a band there, which was the music band, the Tarab. They recruited her, and then she became, of course, very famous, very slow. And she was the very first woman to be taken to India, again across the Indian Ocean, to Bombay, to record, the first woman south of the Sahara to record on this gramophone record. So that was historical. Now these two ladies, they had a passion for not only for them sort of their own advancement, but also for the societies in which they lived. And it will be I'll take up too much time to talk about these two ladies, what they did later on, but they had a very strong sense of justice, you know. And Emily wrote her memoirs, which were published in German, and she followed her husband to Germany. He died within 3 years of their settlement in Germany, and she had children to bring up on her own. And the memoirs talk about her struggles, but the memoirs have much more. Her observation of Germany and the educational system there, the social organization, etc. She's got it all in the memoirs. She was almost like an anthropologist, an ethnographer, from East Africa, observing Germany. And City then, of course, talked about this little area called Ngambo, the other side. You have the stone town in Zanzibar, you have this other side, literally the other side. And the other side, which is called Ngambo in Swahili, had the population which was the lower classes, the working classes, etc., and mostly Swahili. The stone town had the Europeans and the Indians and the Hindus and all the whereas here it was and what divided them was a creek of which has now been filled. But she talked about what was going on in Ngambo, the oppression, the womanizing of some men, etc., etc. She really brought the social aspect in her songs, and also against the British, without the British themselves realizing it, because it was in Swahili, as it were. So this is the story of these two ladies who had mind of their own, as it were, quite ambitious and quite progressive. And I would urge those who are listening to this and watching this to read the memoirs of Princess Salme. When she died, she was buried in Hamburg. So her grave is there. I think she was cremated, but her ashes sort of buried in Hamburg.
Now let's move to the travel accounts by two scholars from India and Persia in the 16th and 17th centuries. So we have Gulfashan Khan, who's talking about the travel experiences of Jamali, who is an Indo-Persian Sufi poet. This is 16th century. So tell us who Jamali was.
Okay. Jamali was, as you said, an Indian Sufi. He was a poet, and he really traveled extensively from Delhi. See, from Delhi, Multan, Baghdad, Mecca, of course, to the Yemen, to Iran. But what he did during his travels, he visited, because he was a Sufi person, he visited other Sufis in the Khanaqahs, in the mosques, in the tombs, and all this. And then he wrote a book which was the biography of Sufis, mostly from India, but also some from elsewhere. And he has left an account of their beliefs, their poetry as well. So this is in Gulfishan Khan, the lady who has written this, the author of this article. She brings out all these aspects and how this genre of the travelogue, because we have so many in Islam, and the famous one, of course, is Nasir Khosrow, which we know of. Okay, how they form part not only of Muslim literature, but also a conveying Muslim knowledge of other places at the time, and they bring them back, as it were, to their own countries, as it were. And he was also a sort of, I wouldn't say in the modern sense an architect, but Jamali was also interested in how he would build his house, as it were. So you had all those things in one person, which is amazing.
He's noticing things that he'd want to decorate, or ways he'd want to build. So he's visiting the Sufi infrastructure, mosques, madrasas, Sufi khanqahs. What do we learn about these Sufi communities of the Indian Ocean from his work?
Excellent. I mean, the travel logs are important in generic sense. They are very important. They are very informative about geography, history, cultures, and sightseeing, even in nowadays terms. But what brings significance to this chapter is she's talking about a travel log of a Sufi traveler or a Sufi poet. And this brings us to talk about how Sufism played a significant role in exchanging cultures and introducing different traditions and rituals as well. So walking through this journey of a Sufi poet would tell us what khanqah or what convents that he stopped by and what observation he observed, and by which we can create a picture. We can draw a map of the interconnectivities between Sufi networks and Sufi groups, because Sufi groups knew each other's even in a distance, either by traveling or meeting in Mecca once every couple of years, and then they give and take from each other's. And teaching is very important as well in the Sufi tradition, but also teaching is not a mono in the mystical dimension of Islam. Not a mono means that it receives other cultures very well. It analyzes it and it utilizes it in the rituals and the poetry. And maybe I can divert slightly and give another example of a Sufi poet who made a significant influence on the Sufi poetry, not only in the Middle East, but also across the Muslim worlds, who is well known as al-Busiri, who wrote al-Burda, with a very significant story behind it, that he was paralyzed and he saw a dream that the Prophet ordered him to write something, and in the morning he will be okay. And then it happened, he was healed, and then he started to write this beautiful praise of the Prophet.
He's from where?
He's Egyptian, and it's in the Mamluk time, it's 13th, 14th century, and he started this masterpiece and wrote 10 chapters of one poem. And then that story ends here. The poem becomes very popular. People use it in their rituals, in salawat, and etc. Until this poem traveled. And this brings us to the circulation of knowledge as well. Knowledge transmission traveled via orality. So this yes, it was written as well, but this poem in particular, because it has a significant role in any Sufi order, because it goes directly to the Prophet, and it has a particular rhyme that people loved it. and they use drums and other musical instruments even. So when you trace this poem traveling from Egypt to Sudan to East Africa to Ethiopia up to India, either its circulation, even West Africa. So people in this circulation, people either they use it as it is, even if they don't know Arabic, but they do the rhythm, or they produce a new knowledge, a new poem that imitate the Burda, because the story is so popular. Someone wrote this and he got healed, then it has a blessing. Okay, let me create something from the beginning on my vernacular, on my original language. Hence, we have tradition in East Africa like Barzanji, and in India, other poems that goes straight to the praise of the Prophet and Ahlul Bayt and so on and so forth. So Sufi tradition is a very rich area study, but also it's very rich social or anthropological area study in a sense. And I always tend to relate it to other culture, because it is indeed relate to other culture. It is based on other cultures in a particular sense, because Sufism is not an Islamic or Muslim tradition as such. It goes to everywhere. It goes to every religion. It goes to every society and every community.
There's also another travel account, which is an unpublished Persian text, the Jama' al-Bar wal-Bahr.
Well,
It's interesting because it's the Indonesian archipelago.
It's by a scholar called Ruqayya Ibrahimi, and she has looked at this manuscript, not published, and there are two sort of very interesting things which come through that. One is that this traveler, Nejapuri, Al-Nejapuri, he went right to the Far East, to Indonesia, and he was talking about the Shia influence over there, and how the traders who were Shia and non-Shia, they looked up. This is what it comes out in the article, that they looked upon themselves as people who are transmitting knowledge to those who do not have knowledge. So there was a little bit of the social stratification within that notion, as it was. So that is one factor which I think comes through the paper. The other is the question of what was the world like at that time in those places. And she talks about also the beginnings of European influence, which came in there. So you are beginning to see a formation of an area which had Shia influence and which had also European influence. So that's very interesting, and I think she's probably working on this manuscript now as a major work to be published. Yes.
Is there anything else you wanted to say about manuscripts and that side of things?
I would just like to touch on the unpublished works of manuscripts. So there is lots of attention given to architecture and monuments, to conservation and preservation, and also there is attention given to manuscripts. But the problem is that there are lots of manuscripts, Arabic or Swahili or Persian, in private collections, that with ages these manuscripts will really disappear because of the poor condition of keeping. And the example that we have here in the book, the two examples, comes from private collections, and now they are preserved, they digitized, they received a very well preservation and conservation projects, and they will survive for other 100 years. We got them from 1800, but with their poor condition that we found them in, we believe that they wouldn't survive another 10 years. But now everybody can rest assured that they can survive another 200 years because of the way that they've been restored and conserved. So I think this is very important point that the books, and especially the first 2 chapters, brings to attention, that people needs to look after their heritage. Individuals have some responsibilities, either to come forward and inform about these works, let any institution know, and then you can help them to make restoration and conservation. Otherwise, we will lose it, because it's public domain. Yes, you might have it in your private collection or library, but it's public domain because there is a knowledge in this particular unique item that people need to learn about and to be educated about.
Let's just stay on that for a little bit. Can you tell us what the status is of preservation on Islamic studies collections in the world?
Yeah, I mean, similar to most of the area studies in the Islamic studies, I mean, we could say in the last 30 years, there is a really significant interest in preserving, first in finding the collections, and then second in identifying this collection, and i.e. introducing these collections to the scholarly community by cataloging them, putting them in printed catalogs or online, because without this, people wouldn't really even know that there is an item somewhere in Timbuktu or in Mombasa. And then comes the preservation and restoration, which is very important. Taking the examples from East Africa, because of the climate nature in this area and the type of papers that they used, it's very short life manuscripts. It just crumbles and it turns into sand, because the way that they used the material, it was low cost manuscripts. The way that they kept it, one manuscript was kept in elephant skin, for example. And this is something that for how long you can keep it in elephant skin? You will lose it one day. Either it will turn into like dust, or it will get rotten. Many projects now in the world, many NGOs are working, even the UNESCO themselves are very interested in going in some areas, especially the areas with problems or political upheavals, and they try to preserve or to keep an eye on the heritage, especially the written heritage, because this is the easiest thing that you can lose in time of wars or upheavals.
You do worry, though, that the entire collections are at risk.
Yes, absolutely. We did have some incidents. I mean, I don't want to go far in history, but the Serbian war, for example, we lost thousands of manuscripts written in Arabic and Persian and Urdu and Ottoman, for example. And the recent problems in West Africa, Mali and Timbuktu, but UNESCO had done a great job as well by sending experts and advising people on how to keep manuscripts safe.
And this interest in manuscripts, I suppose it came to you at quite a young age. Can you give us that sort of seminal example?
Well, yeah, I mean, I grew up in the desert, and by growing up in the desert, I realized that every family or every tribe has their own collection of papers, documents, and manuscripts. But the spark happens when I saw someone burning a collection of manuscripts.
This was your neighbor?
Yeah. I saw him. I did not understand why he is doing this, but when I slightly grow up and get some engagement in the tradition of manuscript culture and manuscript studies, I understood that some groups would look at Sufi manuscripts or manuscript of magics, for example, as a non-useful items or objects, so it has to be burned. So and when I connect the person and his ideology with the event, I realized that he was under this impression that because of his ideology, he would collect all of his grandfather manuscripts, around 200s, where they mainly were on magic, astronomy, and astrology. And he thought that this is a harmful group of books, and he would just clean the house and clean the village from this sinful manuscripts, and he just put this bile in the middle of the street and just burned them. This story, yes, it's maybe 30 years old, but it's still happening, and I'm sure it is still happening, either because ideological background or because people just want to clean their houses. Apart from the Quranic manuscripts, they would treat everything as paper, as a dasht, as scrap papers. But we don't want this to happen. We need all of these fragments to be deposited either in a library or a national archive, or at least to be conserved and preserved, and family can keep it. It's a matter of awareness. Where I was young, seeing this event or incident, no one told this educated. He was very well educated. He was a doctor, in fact, a medical doctor. No one told him that this is harmful action, because everybody believed more or less the same, that these are manuscript that brings curse to the village because it has magics and jinn and spirits inside it. So it's a matter of awareness. These manuscript, magic or astronomy or Sufism, all useful heritage, and it's been written by scholars, not just an ordinary people, and it deserves some preservation. It deserves some well-keeping and also scholarly attention.
Which you are doing. So one last question. You're doing that here.
Yeah.
If anyone's got manuscripts,
yes,
give
yes,
them to Walid.
indeed.
Do you accept all?
I would accept any manuscript. In fact, the manuscript from East Africa came to this building from a family. They purchased it 50 years ago, or maybe more than 50 years ago, and they brought it to this library, thinking, before we put it in the rubbish, would you really consider looking at this one? And you wouldn't believe the amount of dust, insects, and even mold that had inside this manuscript. No one could even touch it. It would form a risk on people, in fact, because the way it was kept inside the box, wrapped in an elephant skin, and then some cloth and other things. But imagine this was kept for like 30, 50 years inside this condition, and then when they brought it here, it was dead. To me, it was literally dead. No one would really survive this manuscript ever, until we get some consultant or consultancy, technical consultant, who said, okay, we'll try to restore it from scratch. And that's the one I wrote about, and I wrote about the story itself, and we still have the manuscript in a very well condition, bound and beautifully done. Colors were restored. This is why we knew that it comes from the Indian Ocean, at least the color palette. I think that's our job as well. I mean, also manuscripts relates to Islamic studies in general sense are so important. These are the primary sources. I mean, without which we can't write, and we can't start even a process of historical knowledge or intellectual history of Muslims. Yeah.
Farouk, why don't you tell us about yourself and how you became interested in these topics?
Well, like Walid, he was born in the desert. I was born in the Indian Ocean. I was born in Zanzibar with, of course, the sea around us. And I think the atmosphere, the cultural atmosphere of cosmopolitan Zanzibar allows you to sort of be one with other cultures, people of other cultures, etc., because of space. We're talking of just a very small island, and the town, Stone Town itself, is very, very small. And within that space, you go to school with students from other religions, other ethnicities, and the way that you celebrate the festivals, the Diwali and the Eid and Christmas and all. It's all together, and I think that's the way. And when I came to London, I took anthropology, social anthropology. So that was my conduit, if you like, into looking at this type of things from a social point of view, a cultural point of view.
During the propagation of Islam across different regions and cultural traditions of the Indian Ocean, a process of adoption and adaptation from local architecture occurred, giving rise to various expressions of its built form, including its religious architecture. So this was happening across the Indian Ocean countries. For example, in India, you see a huge diversity of mosques, depending on the region, the period, and the type of Muslim influence. In the Maldives, for example, you have mosques made from coral stone quarried from reefs, so the local materials. In Indonesia, we see mosques incorporating temple architecture from pre-Islamic times, and you also see Chinese influences and possibly Indian influences too. Now, sharing with us how this played out in the Swahili world is Dr. Daren Ray from Brigham Young University. Dr. Ray, tell us what the Swahili world is.
The Swahili world is a cultural continuum of peoples stretching from southern Somalia on the Kismayu Islands off the coast of southern Somalia, stretching all the way down to Mozambique, incorporating also the Comoros Islands and parts of Madagascar. And so the Swahili world is kind of unified primarily by language. So Kiswahili is the language spoken by these many, many people. Also adherence to Islam for most Kiswahili speakers who are on the coast, though it's become more prominent in inland as well in recent decades.
How did this region become Islamized and when?
The very, very first example we have of Muslims establishing communities in the Swahili world is on the island of Shanga. So Shanga is just off the coast of Kenya, the northeast coast of Kenya. And there we see the beginnings of a mosque. And we know it's a mosque because it's oriented with a qibla towards Mecca. And in the middle of the town, there is also a few burials where the people are buried on their right shoulder facing Mecca. So these are some of the clear indications that we have that there's a Muslim community in this region. From there, we see an elaboration of that mosque structure. So it gets larger and larger and larger. And then we see more mosques being built in the same town. And then they adopt that same kind of mosque architecture and move it into other regions of the Swahili coast or the East African coast.
And what was it that brought Islam? It was trade, presumably?
Yeah, so trade is what first brings Muslims into the East African coast. So East African coast is a wealthy, wealthy place with access to gold, ivory, resin from trees, animal products, mangrove poles, they're used for construction. So people have been coming from the Mediterranean and the rest of the Indian Ocean world to the Swahili coast since at least the 1st century CE that we know of. But one of the things that often brings Muslim communities to East African coast as settlers instead of as traders is as refugees from conflicts in other places. Right, so if there's transitions between, for instance, the Umayyad and the Abbasid Caliphate, that's a moment when people need to find somewhere else to live. And so that's one of the things that brings them into the East African coast. If there's a change in politics in Persia, then that's another thing that brings people to the coast to live.
So Kenya was one of the first countries.
Yes.
Can you describe a bit more what those mosques look like?
Yeah, so one of the things that I had the privilege when I was living in Mombasa is to see lots of different styles of mosque. The most famous one in Mombasa is called Mandri Mosque. Mandri Mosque was first built, we think, in the early 1500s. It's been rebuilt many times since then. But one of the things that's striking about this kind of Mandri Mosque is that, to me at least, it sort of resembles a baobab tree. And so baobab trees, of course, are very widespread throughout Africa. And in East Africa, it's associated with sometimes with ancestor worship, sometimes it's just for instruction from your elders. There's lots of traditions associated with baobab trees. And so it's kind of interesting that this mosque pillar sort of represents I wouldn't say it represents the baobab tree, but there's sort of a similarity, a visual similarity there.
What techniques came over from the Muslims that came to East Africa? Did they bring certain techniques with them?
I mean, building techniques and design techniques. So the clearest example of techniques that were taken from the Islamic world show up in the Kilwa Mosque. So Kilwa is a very prominent town off the coast of Tanzania, and that was the main depot for transshipment of gold that was sourced in Zimbabwe, brought to Kilwa, and then shipped north from there. And in Kilwa, we have an amazing mosque with lots of domes in them. So it's the domes that are kind of the architecture that doesn't really show up anywhere else along Swahili coast. And so the suspicion is that the king of Kilwa, or the sultan of Kilwa, actually just hired someone, an architect, to come in and help design these domes and make it very prominent.
So there are these multiple waves of Islamization of these Swahili lands. Is it possible to break them down into their major phases?
It is.
Without simplifying too much.
Let me let me do it from kind of the Swahili coast perspective.
Yeah.
There is what we call the Shungwaya period, though if you talk to Swahili people, they sometimes prefer to call it the Wangozi period. Wangozi is a Swahili word that means people of leather or people of animal skin. And this Wangozi Shungwaya period, we'll say it's from about 6th to the 10th or 11th centuries. And this is the period where we're integrating Islam into the local communities. So this is the period when Khariji peoples are coming from Saudi Arabia and from North Africa, and they're integrating into probably as refugees, but also as traders and people who at least have enough influence to persuade people to build a mosque for them.
So these were Kharijis that were escaping?
Or escaping, yes. And they're building these mosques, and they're convincing. First, there's a mosque in Shanga, kind of on the outside of the town, and within just a generation, it's in the center of the town. They cut down a tree, and they put this right here in the middle of town. So they have some sort of prominence, but there's also other sort of religious communities that seem to be present. Then the Shirazi period is these are a community coming out of Persia area. And as that is coming apart, we have a degree of refugees coming from that as well. One of the best, most exciting studies in recent history is a study of DNA, where they actually went to all of the different elite cemeteries throughout the Swahili coast, and they were collecting DNA from some of the bodies there. And there's always been a story that Swahili people tell that we're from Shiraz, we're from Persia, we have our ancestors from this area. And historians have always said, like, yeah, well, that's just kind of a myth, and that's just something that you want to share to make yourselves as Muslim as the Arabs. It's kind of a game of status that you're trying to make these claims. And the DNA very clearly says, no, there was a very large population of Persian men who are integrating into these communities. And it lines up, as far as the DNA evidence and dating, as well as you can date that, it's lining up just directly with this Shirazi period from the 10th to 14th century or so. There's another very important dynamic in Swahili history, and that's the connection they have with the Omanis. So this happens kind of in the wake of Portuguese entry into the Indian Ocean. So Portuguese, of course, come around the turn of the 16th century, around 1500. And as they come, they force many of these Swahili cities into submission. So Mombasa is occupied by Portuguese peoples. Faza in the Lamu archipelago is occupied by Portuguese. Zanzibar is occupied by them. And so what they do is this kind of intrusion of a Christian imperial power gets all of these towns that used to be rivals with each other to say, hey, maybe we're not as different as we thought. And so they band together and send a delegation up to Oman, which had some success in expelling the Portuguese from Oman. And for the next century and a half, there's warships and admirals from Oman coming down and trying to expel the Portuguese. And ultimately, they're successful. And from that point, the Omani were dominant on the coast. And I think that's really important in talking about the Islamization of this time period, because what it did was it introduced a new kind of Islamic society that's going to recognize lots of different kinds of Muslims living together. And part of that is because the Omani version of Islam, the Ibadi practice, wasn't very accepting of other Muslims becoming part of their community as ibadis. So of course they had their own Muslim traditions. They're famously known as Sunni Shafi community since the time of at least Ibn Battuta in 1330s. He comes and visits Mombasa and he says they follow the Shafi sect. And so they're continuing as Shafi, but now we also have the ibadis. And then later on, we have immigrants coming from South Asia, and South Asians are coming and bringing their own versions of Islam. So the Bora become a major community, the Khoja become a major community, the Memons become another community. And so we have this kind of vibrancy of the Islamic tradition in East Africa in a way that it's familiar throughout the Indian Ocean. We see lots of these Muslim communities coming together, and they find ways to live with each other. And sure, there's rivalries here and there, and the Omani have their status that they're trying to preserve. But it's kind of this fervent discussion of what it means to be a Muslim and how you share a community as followers of different paths in the faith.
So let's talk about some examples of mosque architecture. So you've talked about these different communities. They've incorporated Swahili elements in their mosques. So can you give us some examples?
Yeah, so one of the beautiful things in East Africa is a tradition of carving. And it's carving plaster, it's carving wood, it's carving these famous ships that were sewn boats, these mitepe. And these sewn boats didn't have any nails in them or anything, and and this was an adaptation to the mooring strategies that they have in East Africa, which is instead of going up to a dock and doing this, they just actually come up to the beach. And so the ship would lay down onto the beach, and by having sewn planks, you're not causing damage to these boats, right? So on these boats, they also have elaborate carvings, and one of the things that the Swahili people picked up from Islam, of course, is that this carving shouldn't be representational of figures. It shouldn't be representation of animals or plants or creation, but should be more geometric and patterns, right? And so I have an example here of a carving that I have in my home. And this is just an example of very symmetrical design here. And you have the sort of ribbing all the way around. This is something we see common in any of the motifs, that there's a border, there's an effort to define the space that's going to be worked in. We have these sort of whorls and sort of all kinds of patterns that you'll see reflected in carvings on doors and other things. And I just want to show you, and we'll show everyone else a closer picture later, but this here is an example of one kind of Swahili door, and there's at least 8 types of Swahili doors, kind of depending on where you are. And so we have kind of a filigree pattern at the top. There's often a post in the middle with these sort of designs that are common. We have a chain going all the way around to define the space. And these are elements that also are shown up in mosques as well, so that sometimes a mosque will have one of these very elaborate doors, and sometimes it will be a very, very plain door. This sort of tapered shape it comes to a point, and then there's kind of it looks like a spade to me, like the spades cards, yeah. And then it kind of opens up. That's a very common way of shaping the mihrab. So you'll see this in Kinzingatina Mosque down in Tanzania, where they're taking some of the ideas they have from these carvings and incorporating it into the actual structure of the mosque itself. They're generally simple, the Swahili ones, but we have also mosques that have come in from South Asia. So we have very elaborate minarets coming. I think I recall the Memon Mosque has a nice tall white minaret in Mombasa. And there are very prominent features in the built landscape that you can walk from corner to corner, and in the neighborhood you're going to pass 5 or 6 mosques almost every single place you go. That's kind of what's defining the physical space of the neighborhood, is all of these different mosques.
You talked to us about the influence of techniques that would have come over from Arabia. What are some other examples of material culture that show this kind of exchange of ideas across the Indian Ocean? So
one example of that is tarab music. So tarab music is kind of a distinctive feature of the Swahili coast that uses Swahili lyrics. And they have using instrumentation that is introduced by the Omani court. Mm-hmm. So they're using ouds and they're using qanuns and they're singing. But they're also, if you listen to it, it sounds very much like South Asian traditional music as well. And so we have the South Asian, we have the Arabian, and we have the Swahili all coming together in this really interesting idea of tarab music. So that's one of the examples of intangible heritage. The other is rice. And this seems not very Islamic, right? As we have an increase of Muslim communities, we also have an uptake in the adoption of rice cultivation. Previously, you used millet and sorghum were the primary crops here. But as they turn to Islam and as they're inviting more and more traders, the traders are telling, well, don't you have any rice? And so they start to develop that as a food preference. And now in East Africa, that's the primary staple. Most people along the coast are eating rice, where most people inland are eating corn or maize. And so that's something that really shapes the whole community, because now you have rice plantations and it's changing the physical daily routines that people are having.
You also brought in some
Oh, yes.
pretty cloths.
So another example of kind of connections between the Swahili world and the rest of the Indian Ocean are these very beautiful cloths that are made. So this is an example of a kikoi. These are generally worn by men. Very simple, has a fringe, but kind of this elaborate bordering, and with the center of a single color, right? And this would be worn as a wrap in formal and informal occasions. Other cloth that they'll wear that's very common around the Indian Ocean is what in Swahili Coast they call a kanzu. I don't have one of those here with me, but a kanzu is a long ankle-length tunic that they wear often during worship. But this is actually patterned, I think, on what's the most common cloth worn in East Africa, and particularly on Swahili Coast, which is a kanga. So just like the carvings on the plaster and on the doors, we're using geometric patterns. We usually see geometric patterns, so often you'll see floral designs on the edge. And there's a border here, and then there is a field in the very middle of the cloth, usually with some sort of design in the middle, and always a name, Jina. So this one's Chakupewa Hakina Nyongoze. What has been given will not be added to in this case. And this has an interesting history in that it first comes...
So it's a phrase.
It's a phrase, and it's a phrase sometimes people use to communicate messages to each other. Because this is something that you'll give as a gift, or it's something you'll wear to someone's wedding, or there's all kinds of messages that they can give as they're wearing these particular cloths around. They're often given as gifts when people are received, and so this is one of the ways that they're melding kind of traditional culture and the Swahili phrases. But this kind of cloth is mostly printed in India. That's where a lot of the production of these cloths were, but they're very dependent on demand in East Africa in order to continue to make them. But the history of this is it started as a Portuguese leso, which is a handkerchief in Portuguese. And the Swahili women came up with this idea of, well, this handkerchief just isn't really big enough to do anything with. So they sew 6 of them together to make what we see here as the standard form. And now, of course, they print them in one single cloth instead of as 6 individual things. But it was really the innovation of the Swahili women to take this sort of Portuguese product and imbue it with meaning in their culture, in their religion, and use it as a way of connecting and fortifying their communities.
Fascinating. How did you get interested in this topic?
Yes, so I took a class in African history at my university, and one of the things that struck me and drew me into the Swahili Coast was this exact issue of underwater mining. It's like, who is going underwater and mining coral? And so it was just a kind of this offhanded comment in the middle of this textbook I'm reading about the Swahili Coast, and yeah, they would just go off into the sea and cut down this special kind of coral called Portuguese coral, and they'd cut it out and they'd bring it to the surface, and then within just a few hours they had to finish everything they needed to do, because of course the coral would dry, it would become brittle, it would become unworkable. And later I've learned that these are this particular kind of carving technique with this underwater coral is the ones that are for the most important pieces, the important parts of the mosque. So it's for the basin where people are washing. It's for the archways, because it provides that extra little structure that you can't quite get with coral rag, which is just kind of brittle material that you can also mine. And so this is where they're going to do all of their fine carving, is with this coral. And so that kind of drew me into the rest of the Swahili world, and I was fascinated by the interplay of many Muslim groups, of Christians, of traditional African cultures, and how it just turned into this melting pot that seemed like a real melting pot, where there's so many people bringing their influences together. Next thing I know, I have a PhD in African history, and I'm pursuing a PhD in African history, and living in Mombasa and trying to make my way into that community and learn more.
Muslim Footprints is developed and produced by Kalima Communications in partnership with the Ismaili, the online platform for the global Ismaili community. This episode was filmed in London by Ali Reza Pedania and Riaz Tinwala, and in Provo, Utah by Tanner Sisson, Nick Fry and Mehdi Lalani, with special thanks to Brigham Young University Broadcasting for the studio. And here's the team at the Ismaili who helped put it together. Amira Jiwani is the series producer. Azim Lakhani is the editor, with assistance from Suraya Mirali for subtitling. Rasul Daya and Alim Karmali have reviewed content and helped with promotion on the Ismaili website. Aziza Jan Mahmood is our social media strategist, who is managing the Muslim Footprints social media accounts, and Alia Muhammad is supporting with promoting the series. Shahid Karim, who oversees the team at the Ismaili, is executive producer for the show, along with me. We're grateful to our external reviewers, who are all members of the board of the Institute of Ismaili Studies. These include Shainul Jiwa, Associate Professor and a Specialist in Fatimid Studies, Orkan Mir Kasimov, Associate Professor and a Specialist in Islamic History, Dr. Hakim El-Nazarov, Head of the Central Asian Studies Unit, Dr. Dagikudo Dagiev, Senior Research Associate and a Specialist in Central Asian Studies, and William Rees Hoffman, Research Associate in the South Asian Studies Unit and an ethnomusicologist. Additional reviews were also provided by Shiraz Alibai, Deputy Director at the Aga Khan Trust for Culture. And thank you all for watching. Be sure to follow our social media pages, where you can find additional content and keep up to date with our news. My name is Aisha Daya, and you've been watching Muslim Footprints.